Oh, it's there.
Yeah.
I want to say hello.
Hi,
I want to talk to you before we're done. I've got some
Yes.
updates, so
great, and
you're here
I,
till tomorrow.
until tomorrow, yeah. Yes. 10 minutes.
You want to grab it? Okay.
I'll see you later. I'm running on coffee. This is my normal. Still waiting to fail. It's not this. Okay, it's stop. What?
You know, find this. Pick up the phone. Not just you. It's a very good. With respect to
Yeah.
a different sense.
Well. Sir, how are you? That's of course. Eventually, yes.
I asked. No. I'll have fun. Everything okay?
It is what it is.
Still having stress over.
Oh. Anyway, so yeah.
That would be my. Yeah. I would elaborate on that. I would. I've never gotten anything right. That's the sort of,
You voting? You're not voting. You're just gonna have your phone on you. Asking a question.
I voted.
Last year, that was-
They have internet issues.
Right, so you're gonna make that count. You won't go to the next one. Why?
309.
That's fine.
Welcome, everyone, to the Education and Training Committee Luncheon. This is mostly an informal presentation and discussion, and that's been the tradition for the last few years. We're going to have three fantastic panelists, and I'm joined by my co-moderator, Dr. Laura Johnson, who we are very lucky at Emory to have just stolen and to get in the last 6 months. She's the director of the Burn Unit at Grady. And if you want to hear about adventures of what it's like to be the director in the first 6 months, talk to Laura. But I would recommend you bring a drink to her when you do that. So our goal today is pretty simple. We're going to be talking about something that's coming down the pike, which are EPAs. And I'm not going to answer that because that's obviously our first question. And then I'll turn it over to Dr. Johnson to introduce to you a little bit about how the flow is going to be for today. and then we'll introduce the panelists. But for everyone, for internet's sake, if you are not able to log into the internet very well or to connect, use your cell phone and use your cellular. We're having some issues in this room with using the Weston Wi-Fi. But I'm going to turn it over to Dr. Johnson for a little bit to talk a little bit about what the process is going to be of Q&A, and then I'll introduce the speakers.
All right, good morning still, everybody. Thank you, Joe, for that introduction. Yes, so in the interest of making a kinder, friendlier Socratic method to get discussion moving and really to have people engaged, you'll notice that within your meeting app, there is a link to the ENT Luncheon polling option. As you move through this today, we're going to have a number of prompts to talk about what an EPA is, how it's going to potentially impact our feedback process, and again, to really allow everyone in the room access to talk about where we think these are going. This is led by the room, so I really need everyone to engage. There's microphones, there's going to be a roving question microphone, and then there is the app, which can allow everyone who maybe has a question but doesn't necessarily want to be at a microphone to submit. So again, please, this luncheon is successful when people are engaged in answering the questions, so we really would like to see that happen. So let's go back to the first poll. All right, go ahead.
All true answers.
They are all true. Well, almost all of them are true answers.
So to explore this wonderful and new topic, this was a suggestion by Dr. Brian Richmond when we met at the ENT committee meeting a few months ago, almost a year ago. And I think it was a fantastic situation to discuss, because I actually had to learn a little bit about this myself. And so it's coming down the pike, and to have better illumination from what I would call the subject matter experts. I'd like to invite Dr. Jacob Greenberg, who's a gastrointestinal surgeon, general surgeon, and weight loss surgeon at Duke University. His research has focused both on the clinical care of patients with hernias and abdominal wall, and he has been a program director in actually numerous places. He obtained his medical degree from University of Pennsylvania and completed his residency at Brigham and Women's Hospital and his fellowship in minimally invasive and bariatric surgery at the University of Massachusetts Memorial Medical Center. Dr. Greenberg, would you please come to the panel? Next is Dr. Vanessa Lindeman, who's a native of Kentucky, so welcome to the Southeastern. Received her MD from Vanderbilt and is a member of AOA. She did a residency in general surgery at Johns Hopkins University and completed a fellowship in endocrine surgery, yay, at Harvard Brigham and Women's Hospital. Her clinical interests include thyroid cancer, benign thyroid disease, hyperparathyroidism, adrenal disease, and surgical treatment of inherited and endocrine syndromes. Dr. Lindeman has distinguished herself as a surgical educator. She served as administrative chief resident at Hopkins and won both the medical student teaching and the resident teaching awards. She earned a master's of education in the health professions from Johns Hopkins University and has served as a member of the board of directors of the Association for AMC for the last 4 years. She's also author of the core entrustable professional activities for entering residency. And at UAB, she's associate designated institutional official for clinical learning environment, and says her desire is to improve the education experience of medical students and residents at UAB and across the United States. And last but not least, please, Dr. Lindeman, come up, is Dr. George Sorosi, who is the Robert Hucks Professor and Director of the Surgical Residency Program at University of Florida College of Medicine. Dr. Sorosi obtained his medical degree from Harvard Medical College and completed his internship, residency, and GI surgery fellowship at University of Michigan Medical Center. Research interests include laparoscopic GI surgery, the role of bile salts in malignant progression in Barrett's esophagus, and bile salt evoked growth signaling in Barrett's esophagus. Dr. Sorosi, please come and join us at the panel. A round of applause for our panelists. I think you will find them to be the experts in this field. All right.
Okay, so additionally, I would like to thank Dr. Sharma, our chair of the ENT committee, and the rest of the ENT committee who were contributed to this discussion about what we were going to talk about, and again, our panelists. So the first thing we want to know is who's in the room. So everyone has hopefully learned a little bit about, or at least contributed to the EPA question. Let's see how polling works. Excellent. So we have a full spectrum of participants. And you'll notice that I left it as PGY 8+. So that's 8 to 78, depending on how long you've been doing this. So really stakeholders across the entire spectrum of surgical education. So the next question we want to know, again, just demographics to get started and understand the flavor of the room is, has anybody here already started using entrustable professional activities? Were you part of the pilot program? Do you have your own homegrown variation based on your understanding of what an EPA is? And or do you have no idea whether you've been using it? All right. So I think that actually is, this slide is why we decided to have this discussion today, right? So there's frankly, that 27% who don't know, this is specifically for you guys. So thank you very much for acknowledging that. So let's find out. How many people here love getting feedback on their performance? Thank you, sir. And thank you for the honesty. All right. Round 2. I love giving feedback on someone else's performance. Excellent. All right, we'll give everyone a chance. Yep, that's about what I would have expected. And so here's the opportunity. And if people have answers to this question and are courageous enough to come up to the mic, go right ahead. But what are some of the challenges of giving feedback on performance? Excellent. Please introduce yourself so we know who you are.
I'm Dr. McCaffrey. I'm from Vanderbilt Medical Center, and I'm one of the breast surgeons there. And I'm very interested in medical student resident education. And feedback is such a challenge, right? To have it be received well and to give actionable feedback, right? Like the classic eval that you get says, "Great job, read more." That's useless versus you really need to work on your deep dermal suturing with your right wrist, making the full, things like that are more actionable, I think are useful. But sometimes given limited time with the person, with the trainee or the student, it's really hard to find something instructive to say that's granular. So I'll say that.
Okay. I think that, no, I know that was fantastic. So, Dr. Sharma.
So I think as the answers come in, kind of obvious.
What we're going to ask first. So Dr. Greenberg, what is an EPA?
So. The guy? Yes. So an EPA is an entrustable professional activity. It is also the other 4 things that you had listed up there, most notably the Environmental Protection Agency. But in this situation, it's an entrustable professional activity. So it's a holistic based work assessment. So essentially, take a unit of work that we can observe in real time. So how well one of you guys as residents takes care of a patient with appendicitis from start to finish. Do you make the diagnosis, do the physical exam, review the imaging, consent them for surgery, perform the operation, take care of their postoperative discharge instructions, and talk to the patient and family about their expected outcomes in their course. And then we decide how much we can entrust you to do that with the next patient. So I've watched you go from start to finish as an entire professional. And at the level of a chief resident or a fellow, I would expect that you can do all of those things. And so in my mind, I don't really need to be as present to give you much oversight and assistance with it versus an intern who's learning it all for the first time where I have to be present from all of it. So it's basically taking the assessments that we do and that we perform in real time and then centering them around one clinical entity or a disease process.
Dr. Lindeman, why make this move to have this level of specificity? And how did the idea of EPAs come about?
Yeah, so I will tell you, The idea of EPAs was actually developed back in 2005 by a PhD education scientist in the Netherlands by the name of Ole ten Cate. He has published several volumes of work around this concept, and they really moved toward it in several European countries, and as well as our partners in Canada, the UK, other nations internationally. In the US, EPAs got their start in the medical school domain. And what happened was the AAMC, the Association of American Medical Colleges, wanted to figure out what we could really say that medical students could do at the end of medical school. If you think about it, no one actually says what medical students can do, right? You like go through a curriculum and like we feed all of this stuff into you, we pour this knowledge in. Nobody figures out if you actually know things or can do things. And so that was the idea, is to say what people are able to do as they enter residency. So that was back in 2014, those were made available. And then people pretty quickly said, oh, this makes a lot of sense. We should move this into the residency space. And so, you know, pediatricians, they're very like developmental in their thinking, right? Like babies to toddlers to kids and so on. So the pediatricians went first, and they have really been the leaders in this space. But really, the surgeons kind of went next and said, you know, this paradigm really seems to capture what it is that we do. And so surgery has been really an early leader, beginning with the definition of 5 EPAs as a pilot. That was back in 2018. And then that pilot was conducted at 28 sites across the United States for 2 years. Now, if you do your math, and I'm thinking about it, 2018, that would put this into spring of 2020. And so the last of the pilots sort of, you know, was impacted by the COVID-19 pandemic. But nonetheless, that trial demonstrated that collection of EPA assessments, which we can go into a little bit further, was something feasible to do. And the thing I was going to add at the end of Dr. Greenberg's description, when people ask me about EPAs, and I think about, you know, what they are and why we've been making this movement, every time I enter the operating room and I stand across the table from a resident, if I've never worked with them before, or even if I have, I've pretty much already decided exactly what I'm going to let them do in that case. Right? And probably the PGY 8+ sitting in this room share that feeling. And I'm making that decision on flawed metrics. I'm making that decision based on their PGY level, which we all know is a poor approximate of what someone can actually do. I'm making that decision based on my own personal experience, how much I have worked with them, or maybe I've asked them, hey, how many of these have you done? Or I'm making that decision based on rumors that I've heard about them through the residency program. And that maybe is not great. That's maybe okay. That's a system that has been in place for a long time and it works reasonably well. But we're making these decisions about how much we trust people all the time, multiple times a day, and we don't capture them. And they're not based on any standardized descriptions of behavior. And so it's those last 2 things that EPAs change. It allows us to document the trust that we are giving to our trainees, that they are earning. And it allows us to do so based on these descriptions of behavior that allow us to remove the emotional judgment out of our decisions.
That was fantastic. Could you give us some examples of what an EPA would be, just so everybody's kind of level set it here?
Sure. So the first 5 from the EPA pilot were chosen because they represent the core of what general surgery is. They're things that everybody could agree on are definitely general surgery. Those initial 5 start with evaluate and manage a patient with an inguinal hernia, right lower quadrant pain or appendicitis, gallbladder disease, blunt or penetrating trauma, and then the 5th one is provide general surgical consultation. There are 13 more, which I cannot recite from memory, so please don't be as impressed.
That's fantastic. Dr. Sorosi, so why did the American Board of Surgery make this move? And what led to, I mean, both speakers before you talked a little bit about it. Could you go in a little bit more detail on why we're making this move?
Yeah, sure. So I think, so first of all, anybody who's been around surgery for a long time knows that about every decade or two, the world of surgery says, hey, we're not doing that great a job training people, and we got to do something different. And so about, I don't know, 2014, 2015, the board was again looking at, the structure of residency. There's this perception, you guys have all seen there was the famous article by Mattar and colleagues that was presented at the American Surgeon that said that, a third of graduating general surgery residents can't be trusted to do a cholecystectomy by themselves. There's always this perception, I think, by senior people, right? The residents today, they're just not as good as I was, right? That happens all the time, right? And I think there was this recognition that if you actually stop, and I'll just stop for a really quick second. I just want a quick show of hands. How many people in this room have been or are a program director? Okay. So what's the thing the American Board of Surgery asks you to do at the end of someone's residency? You sign this statement that says that I certify that this person has knowledge of the science of surgery, manipulative skills, the ability to care for patients, and is basically ready for consideration as a specialist in surgery. And I can tell you, as a longtime program director, the first time I had to do that, I'm like, I have no idea, right? Because you're given this statement, which sounds, I mean, it's like a blessing, right? You're literally saying this person's ready, and you're not really provided with any metrics by which to assess them at. And what happened at the board level with the board's redesign about 5 years ago, the board created an assessment committee, and the assessment committee looked at the ABS requirements for certification, and they thought about them in kind of 3 categories, right? So there are 3 moments that the board assesses someone, right? So they assess you at the completion of residency. They then submit you to some exams, which are a qualifying and a certifying exam, and then they would provide kind of continuous certification. So there are really, if you think about the domains that the board thinks about, there are really kind of 4 domains in a surgeon's professional life they think about. They think about, your clinical skills, and those really fall into 2 categories: your sort of diagnostic and knowledge skills and your ability to perform surgery. They think about knowledge and sort of your medical knowledge, and that's, the qualifying exam is a medical knowledge exam. And then they ask questions about professionalism. The problem is that if you look at the ways that the board currently assesses that, the assessment of technical skills is maybe FLS, a case log, which just is a log of what you actually participated in, not what you can do, and the FES exam, right, which are, a couple of relatively low fidelity sort of technical skills exams. And then maybe the oral exam is an assessment of your ability to do surgery. And then you got 6 assessments of your ability to perform operations done by somebody over the course of your residency, right? Now that right there, you're getting nervous, right? Because if you're a student of assessment of operative skills, you know that it takes at a minimum somewhere between 10, 18, or 25, depending on which piece of literature you believe, to assess whether someone can do an operation. So 6 sort of random assessments don't really tell you anything. And so at the end of the day, we were basically asking program directors, say, hey, this person's ready to operate, and not providing them with a yardstick. And so with the growth of this movement towards competence-based education, it became clear that we needed to provide training programs and program directors, and actually more importantly, the American public, with some idea of what the yardstick was that we said at the end of your 5 years of training, you're ready to practice surgery. And so this concept of EPAs, so they're entrustable professional activities. I think EPA could also stand for essential professional activities. If you think of a universe of EPAs for a specialty, they should kind of describe the core of that specialty. And that's certainly the goal. And then Holly Coretta Wire is an emergency medicine physician. And she said, actually, the best way to think about EPAs is their everyday physician activities, right? They're the things that you do all the time that are essential for your practice. And, up to this date, we've really not looked at that, which is, I think, a little bit embarrassing. And I think the board's recognition of that and their desire to sort of create a clinical assessment, a standardized clinical assessment in residency that sort of becomes a yardstick for program directors and training programs and for the learners. And I think that's the really important part about EPAs, because for the residents in the room, right, the hardest part about residency that nobody really talks about is you don't really know how you're being assessed, right? You know what the assessments are, but nobody gives you the yardstick. Nobody tells you what you need to do to get to the next level. You sort of figure it out, a little bit by sometimes somebody says nothing, so you probably did a good job. Sometimes somebody chews you out, so you didn't do a good job. Sometimes the patients do well, sometimes the patients do poorly. There's no real yardstick for you to judge your progress or to look forward and say, if I can do this, I would do that. And then by basing it on entrustment or the level of supervision, it's really natural, right? So the goal is to be at a practice ready level where you don't need supervision. And so, but you have to get there by being, not allowed to do things. You can watch me, or I'll let you do it, but I'm going to be right here and I'm not going to leave your side until you're done. Or, I'll let you get started and I'll show up for the complex part. Or maybe I don't need to be there at all, which is really powerful. And so that knowledge of the need to make that progression is really what drove the board to do this, really so that we could certify to the public that people who are board certified are capable of doing the important things in surgery without requiring supervision.
All right. So I really appreciate all of those perspectives. And certainly if there are other perspectives in the room on this, please do not hesitate. We're all surgeons to get up to the mic. And I think, Dr. Tenkate, as Dr. Lindeman described, has written about this for a long time and made the point that we really need to stop calling things competencies if we can't figure out how to describe them within the purpose of an EPA. So how is this practically going to work? And I will tell you that I took this directly from the ABS's documentation on this and the publications that come from this. So bear with me. I apologize. The text is small, but this is a second-year resident who has been asked to look at a patient with an inguinal hernia. They're able to get a history of nausea and constipation when the patient has the hernia incarcerated, but then it's reducible, get some history, is able to reduce the hernia when the patient's in the right position under physical exam, is able to present this to the attending, but asks the attending to verify their exam for them, and does not give a thorough differential diagnosis, as would be expected. Recommends a laparoscopic hernia repair with mesh. But then when prompted about some of the patient's past medical history or chronic medical history, needs the prompting, but then is able to talk about a change in plan secondary to their lung function. Is able to go through the informed consent discussion, though omits some of the key portions when the attending is listening outside the room for a discussion, and confirms the full nature of the consent with the patient before surgery. So already we have some idea that perhaps this resident is missing some key components, but is still moving forward with the care of the patient. In surgery, the patient would with the patient asleep, the resident needs some prompting about where they're doing their surgical incisions, is able to at least talk about the anatomy that they're expecting to see, but are not necessarily protecting that anatomy effectively in the operating room, is not doing the best job with those bites with the suture, as we were talking about earlier, and but is still able to perform a layered closure once the mesh is actually in place and the knots are corrected. Postoperatively sees the patient for concerns for urinary retention, but still has to call his supervisor to make sure that that's the right plan. And once that's done, is still able to send the patient home effectively. And then sees the patient back in clinic, identifies that the patient's had one problem, but then misses the fact that the hernia has recurred. So this is a full spectrum, the full management of a patient with an inguinal hernia. So what feedback would this resident typically receive?
I just want to say exactly none.
I think it was like right around this time of residency where I got my favorite feedback of all time, which was you're not good, but at least you're slow, which is really like a double negative when you think about it.
I was still training in the era when it was, if they're still yelling at you, it's because they care.
So just thinking about this and how the EPAs will help address this, I think one of the challenges in the scenario you presented is that the way that our residency program is structured, continuity is not always provided. So the resident may not see some of these postoperative sequelae. So it's hard to lump the feedback and maybe get it to the right person in the right context. I think that's one thing we can do by coalescing everything into anchoring behaviors as you'll describe. So
I think that's a really important point. I think I just want to make this point. So the EPAs as assessment tools are designed into phases of care, because I think what everybody who listens to this discussion is thinking about is like, I don't know that I ever see a patient pre-op do the operation and see the same patient post-op. And if I do that, I probably don't do it with the same attending anymore, because you know that sort of structure of residency has changed, right? The 80-hour work week changed a lot of things. And so a lot of it is prioritized for training about being in the OR, you're in pre-op and post-op less. And the way the EPAs are structured is you just get feedback on one of the phases at a time. You don't have to see the same patient with the same attending for each of the phases of care in order to get feedback. And I think that's really important. We need to figure out as a training program or as a board or you as a trainee need to figure out you can provide the full spectrum of care. But I don't know that a single person has to follow you all the way through, because outside of honestly taking care of a patient with appendicitis, which you might, see the patient on a 24-hour call shift in the ER, do the operation, and then send them home the next day. That's about the only thing in modern surgical care where likely the same resident and the same attending are going to care for the same patient throughout the whole thing. So this ability to break it up, to give feedback on the phases of care, allows a training program and a resident to get assessment on the whole spectrum of care without requiring that someone follow you around the whole time to make sure you do it, which is just never going to happen, right? Nobody has the time for that.
Dr. Sorosi, as you talk a little bit about the phases of care, do you think that the EPAs bring additional or feedback where traditionally we've had no feedback for a particular phase of care? Or is there a place where it's more validated?
So I think we can get into this when we talk a little bit about the EPA pilot, but it will surprise no one here that the vast majority of our assessments in the EPA pilot were done in the intraoperative phase, right? The one place that we know with a lot of certainty that attendings or residents are together, seeing the same patient at the same time, is in the operating room. It turns out, and it probably surprises no one in this audience, we tend to entrust pre and post-operative care at a very early stage and not observe it very much. And it's actually, I mean, my own personal experience is pretty striking. Sometimes you'll go see a chief resident, see a patient, and you're like, wow, actually thought they were a little more compulsive than they actually are. And I think we entrust a lot by how long we've known people, how much we like them, not necessarily by how well they do their job. And these check-ins at various stages to see that people are actually doing what they're supposed to be doing are really valuable, because and I think there's a belief, at least by many of the people behind this, that being a surgeon is not just doing operations, right? Being a surgeon is caring for patients, making sure the right patient gets the right operation, or maybe doesn't get an operation, that the operation is done well, and that really good, high quality post-operative care is provided to allow the patient to return to full function.
So we'll get back to the pilot in a minute. I just want to ask the room, based on what you heard and your knowledge of milestones and competencies, how would you answer this question? Several of the residents' competencies are at level. and for the residents in the room, understand that these are the questions, again, as we're generating your milestone reports and the clinical competency reports, this is what these questions start to come down to. So as we think about this same scenario, I would then ask the question, do you trust this resident to perform an inguinal hernia at the level of an expert? Right? Which is now suddenly a totally different question. I really appreciate the not yets. That's awesome. Is that what that's, yes. I tried really hard to make sure that they couldn't say yes. Okay, all right. So again, I think the pilot data is really important and Dr. Sharma has some questions about it, but just so everybody knows, this is the most current diagram that I borrowed from an ABS presentation on the entrustable professional activities that are coming. So this is all 18 of them, including the 5 that have already been piloted. And you can see that they encompass, as a burn surgeon, I would say the skin and its contents, and really the diseases that we expect by the end of general surgery residency training, people are able to manage from start to finish. So comments?
So I think as a faculty member, when you look at this looks overwhelming, right? And you think to yourself, oh my God, I'm going to have to evaluate every single resident on 18 different things every single day of my life. And that's, I think, false. I think you have to think about this as you're going to evaluate your residents on what's within the scope of your specialty, right? So myself as an MIS surgeon who focuses a lot on ab wall reconstruction and bariatrics, I'm going to do inguinal hernia. I'm going to do ventral hernia. I'm going to do gallbladder disease. And that's honestly probably most of what I will be evaluating residents on. So the 3 things that I do a lot of, that's going to be very different from Dr. Lindemann, who's going to do thyroid, parathyroid, and very different from a trauma critical care surgeon who's going to do stuff within the scope of their practice. So even though this 18 looks overwhelming, probably any given specialist is going to do 2, 3, maybe 4, and really focus on that area of expertise in which you practice.
So Dr. Lindemann, could you talk a little bit about pilot? How do we arrive to these areas and what did you guys feel after the pilot?
Sure. That's a pretty broad question, but let me just tell everyone in the room a little bit more about the ABS pilot. So I think I said before, there were 28 programs that volunteered to participate. And there were 5 EPAs that were defined at the time. And if you look on the slide, they're the ones that are shaded slightly darker than the others. I listed them out loud a little bit ago. I'll spare you from that again. But each program was not asked to collect assessments about all 5. There were some overachieving programs like Wisconsin and at my own program where we did collect data on all 5, but programs were assigned to collect data about 2 of the EPAs. And then they were provided with some materials like a toolkit. They were provided with the question to ask, and I'll tell you about what that is specifically in just a minute because I want to call attention to it, and particularly that collection of these EPA assessments are not onerous. But then after that, to borrow a phrase from Dr. Greenberg, besides that, there were no rules. And people were encouraged to innovate around how they were to collect these EPA assessment data points. And so there was a lot of variability. Dr. Greenberg's program at Wisconsin was far and away the most successful and collected, I don't know, like well over 3,000 EPA microassessments. Many programs were somewhere in the middle in the range of a few hundred. And there were some programs that never got off the ground, right? That maybe collected a handful or maybe collected, I think there was at least one program that collected 0, 2 programs that collected 0. And so there are lots of great lessons to be learned in that. I should probably let you have answered this question because he's leading the best practices committee that's defining what some of those things are. But I'll just back up and tell you about the nuts and bolts for how these things are collected, right? Because I think that's one of the really important keys is we often think about, oh, we're going to do this operative assessment, or we're going to fill out this, mini CEX in clinic. And it's this tool that's like this long and it's 10 or 15 questions. And, you have to go through and fill out the whole thing. This is not at all that way. On average for this if you take out the narrative feedback part, on average, it takes about 15 to 18 seconds to fill this out. And so it's 2 items. The first one is what's the complexity of this case? Because that's going to affect how much you are entrusting someone, right? If it's really straightforward, you might allow them a little bit more autonomy versus if it's a really complex case, then you might, by necessity, allow a little less. And then the second question is, if faced with this same problem again, I would trust this resident at X level. And then those levels are, as one of the 2 of my colleagues have alluded to, limited participation, where I really let you do very little, direct supervision, where I have to be there right at your side, indirect supervision, where, you maybe start, maybe I show up, maybe I'm just available by phone, but I am directly or indirectly available to you. And then practice ready, where I don't think you really need me there at all. There's a 5th level that's a little bit more aspirational that mirrors the language from the milestones, and all of the EPAs are directly mapped to that. We can explore that a little bit further if folks would like.
Yeah, so we and many of the other programs used an app-based solution for our micro assessments. We generated one in-house, simple program, adapted one of their modules to be able to do this too. I think the key to success for this in our program was that we spent an enormous amount of time at the beginning of each academic year and with several touch points during the year on both faculty and resident development, right? This is, as you guys are all coming to realize, this is very different than what we usually do. And so to just say, hey, we're doing EPAs now, that doesn't really work, right? So I think it takes a little bit of training. It takes a decent amount of understanding and prep as to how you're going to assess people within this framework. But then once we started doing it, the residents really felt like they were getting improved feedback compared to what they normally had. We saw an increase in the number of teach assist cases in our program, which to me was evidence of increasing autonomy. And the faculty did not feel that this was an onerous task for the most part, in addition to their usual workflows. So we found a lot of real tangible benefits to this. But across the board, the programs that struggled, I think struggled because there was not enough infrastructure and support in terms of faculty and resident development. The other thing that we saw, and one of the benefits of having now 18 versus 5, is that residents would come on, say, MIS, and they would get evaluated in inguinal hernia and gallbladder, and then they would go to surgical oncology, where there are 0 EPAs of those original 5. And for 2 months of their year, they wouldn't get any assessments, and they would lose that rhythm of asking for that feedback on a day-to-day basis. So having EPAs that can be on every different service and making this part of everyone's daily workflow, I think will really help with integration and implementation into practice.
No, by all means, Dr. Cornwell.
First of all, what a great choice for a panel. Thank you all for that. You kind of are have rubbed our nose in the fact that for many years, for decades, we've tried to fit everyone into every square peg into a 5-year hole. And if I'm understanding this as what it's going to look like coming down the pike, and I think that not yet answer was important. We don't say, no, you're not ready. Not yet. You have to do more and more and presumably get to the point where the answer is yes. But obviously that's not going to be everyone in 5 years. So when this comes down the pike, are we now going to start having variable length of residency for the various proficiencies that we all have always seen in ourselves, our colleagues, and the people we train? And thanks for a great panel.
Let me answer that. I'm going to speak for Dr. Beisky, and she won't. I'm sure that I'm not speaking properly, but I think one of the challenges, if you think about training, is there are two things that happen in a residency. The first thing is we hire you for a job for 5 years. And the second is we train you to be a surgeon. And we've always assumed that those two things overlap. You know, Tim Flynn, who many of you know, used to say, follow me around for 5 years, you might learn something, right? Which is, I think, historically what residency training was like. I think that we know some from Canada that when you do a competency-based training program, and the Department of Orthopedics at the University of Toronto are probably the people who've really executed this the best. The entire nation of Canada and the Royal College of Physicians and Surgeons are moving to EPAs for every training program in Canada, and they're about 2/3 or 3/4 transitioned at this point. They haven't graduated anybody yet in their competence by design program, but orthopedics at Toronto did this. They started out as just a pilot. Half of their residents did it. After the first year, the residents who weren't in the competency-based program were like, we're getting ripped off. The guys in the competency-based program are getting all these assessments. They're getting all this feedback, and the rest of us are just getting our usual end of rotation evaluations. And so they migrated to that over about a 5-year period. When they looked at their graduates, what they learned is that most people ended up graduating in 5 years. About maybe a quarter of people could actually get done in 4 years, and maybe an eighth of people needed more time, usually about 1 more year to achieve the goals. Variable time in training is sort of the, I think it's one of the implications of a competency-based program. I think in the United States, it will be very hard to change that right now because of the way that funding is done. People get funding for 5 years. I think from an ABS standpoint, someday maybe we'll get to variable time in training. I think people will train for 5 years. I think they may not achieve practice-ready entrustment in all of these 18 EPAs at the time of graduation, but at least we'll have an understanding of where they are, because right now we don't actually have that understanding. And if you think about development as a professional, it's not like you finish your training and you're done with your development. All of the experienced surgeons in the room know that you probably get better as a surgeon for somewhere between 5 and 10 years after you finish your training. And I think maybe 10 years into your career, you're probably as good as you're going to get. And that's part of why I think junior faculty and mid-level faculty think residents aren't as good as they used to. As a resident, as an attending, you get better and better every day. And a fourth-year resident is a fourth-year resident is a fourth-year resident. As you get further from it, it's like Groundhog Day, right? You get better and better, and they're sort of at the same stage. So I don't know. Variable training is I think pragmatically, it's going to be really hard to do. And I think that what this will help us with is it will help us identify the gaps where people are maybe not quite practice ready. And so as they transition to their career, they know where maybe they need a little more help. And potentially, you know, maybe the people they'll be working with know where they need more help, which would really help them transition them into your practice.
And I would just like to add one thing onto that. Sorry. You know, I think right now in our system that it is in many ways punitive to hold someone back and have them repeat a year, right? That really affects their ability to obtain a fellowship. It probably affects their employability when they're done. And for many of those people, it's not their fault, right? I would say it's more likely our fault, but just needing a little bit more time and ending up being an outstanding surgeon is not failure. And right now in our system, if we remediate people, it is. And I think that's really unfair to people. And if we shift away from you have to be at point X in 5 years to be, we want you at point X when you get there, is I think a better way for us to handle the training of professionals.
Thank you, Eli Oliver Emery. A couple of questions to the last few points that are being made. First, does your experience in the pilot implementation of this, did you find an ability to account for sort of progression over a PGY, you know, level? I think many of us would likely agree that the description of the resident, you know, that we went through would be taken very differently in July of PGY 2 year versus in May or June of PGY 2 year. And then second, kind of, you mentioned the wording of the question, faced with this exact same situation down the line, do we trust this person? I think some, at least speaking for myself, of the anxiety of thinking of getting more autonomy as you go is not necessarily in dealing with the exact same situation again, but rather running into more complex, more complicated, or maybe unforeseen situations. And what was your experience in looking at a resident's ability to handle that adversity as they were given more autonomy or progressing into independent practice with respect to these EPAs?
Thank you so much. Those two questions are incredibly important. And I wish we could have planted you in the audience to ask them.
He's from Emory. I planted him.
Perfect, thank you. So the first question regarding PGY level, you're right, people do progress within a PGY year. And my hope, this is my secondary hidden agenda, is that the use of EPAs will finally help us break what the milestones intended to help us break, which was this reliance on PGY level as a marker of competence. They are not the same. And so intentionally, the way these are written, it's not supposed to be that a PGY 1 is at a level 1 entrustment level. That's limited participation. They may start there, but probably they'll get past that pretty quickly. At least that's what we found happened in our training program for those 5 during the pilot. And so I think you bring up also what is a great research question, right? So what are learning curves? We'll have more data than we've ever had before to understand how surgeons develop. To your second question about autonomy and what do we do with people, in scenarios they've never seen before, I often use this analogy that what we are collecting are formative assessment data, right? Frequent, low stakes. Any one assessment of an EPA means almost nothing. And it's really putting those data points together that we utilize them within the Clinical Competency Committee, the CCC, to look at them and make a more summative decision about where someone is at, right? So I might be, at an indirect supervision level. If you put all of my assessments together, maybe I've got, 3 or 4 at direct supervision, maybe I've got 3 or 4 at practice ready, and I've got like 10 at indirect supervision. So the CCC is probably going to slot me at indirect supervision overall. And that's based on the complexity of those cases, those individual scenarios. But I liken that summative entrustment decision to giving a driver's license, right? If you think about it, we grant the ability for 16-year-old children to take over the power of a 2-ton piece of metal and drive it at about 70 miles an hour. And that's probably conservative. And we don't test them in every scenario they could face. We don't test them by making them go out and drive on the interstate or drive in heavy traffic or when a log falls in the road in front of them. You never know what could happen, but we test them enough. As a society, we have this agreement that we test them enough that we believe that they have the baseline level of competence and that they will continue to grow in skill over time. And so we need to begin thinking about our entrustment in the same way.
Dr. Stewart, and then we'd like to move a little bit into the other phase of this discussion, which is what it looks like, the program looks like, and implementation. So please go ahead.
So thank all of you for your work with the board on bringing EPAs to the forefront. We know milestones started, and now I think we're about to get it across the finish line. So just in terms of thinking about equity in residency care, I think the literature is replete with data that show that there are inequities with advancement of residents. There are inequity in terms of dismissal from programs. Can you address how this EPA project can help us get to a more even playing field?
It's a great question.
I'm happy to field that one. So I actually think that this will help. The way that the EPAs are written, they are all written with very descriptive behaviors of each level of entrustment for each different thing you're assessing. So each of the 18 EPAs, 17 of them have 3 phases of care. Each of them have 5 levels of entrustment. There are descriptive behaviors and clinical vignettes that describe what a resident, any resident at that level should be looking like, regardless of race, color, gender, sexual identification, right? It is just a descriptive behavior. And so I think that very descriptive anchoring will hopefully help to get rid of some of the inequities that we see. We actually studied our data at the University of Wisconsin. At Wisconsin, we are very good at gender equity. We are very poor with underrepresented minorities, in terms of the number of underrepresented minorities in our program. But we're about 50-50, both faculty and resident, man-women split. And we looked at the assessments of male residents and female residents and found from the faculty level, no difference based on gender. We did find that female residents actually tend to under-evaluate themselves compared to their male counterparts by about 1 PGY level. but there was no gender differences based on the faculty assessments. And that's in contradiction to some previous studies which have shown that there are significant inequities. So it's my hope that it will help, but I think it's a little early to tell.
One thing I'd just like to add, that going with what Dr. Greenberg said, I think if you think about what an entrustment statement says, it's not that when a faculty entrusts you, they're not saying I entrust you to take care of your patient. They're actually saying I entrust you to care for my patient, right? If you think about it, like my saying that you're ready to do this with oversight only at a practice ready level, I'm not assessing your ability to take care of your patient at some day in the future. I'm assessing your ability to take care of my patient the next time we do it together, which I think is an incredibly powerful, positive statement of my faith in you, right? Because I think it's a higher bar. We all have partners, right? And when your partner's patient is having problems, well, when it's your patient, it's a totally different thing. It's human nature. I think the other thing I wanted to emphasize, and I think one of the things that's really important in entrustment, and we asked that question, well, I don't get a chance, don't get a chance to see me at everything. One of the things that's really critical for entrustment is the knowledge that someone you're entrusting has the humility to say, I need help, right? And it's that help-seeking behavior. It's probably more important than knowledge or ability. Entrustment is generated by the knowledge that you recognize the limits of your ability and you'll ask for help when you get there. And that is so critical in an entrustment. And we don't really think about that very much right now because we're not actually asking ourselves. We generally rate people on what we see. We don't rate them in a forward way, in a forward-thinking way. And it's that forward-thinking thing. The next time we saw the same patient, I know because we were doing this gallbladder and we didn't see a good critical view and you got really hesitant, you stopped and I'm like, why aren't you going? You're like, well, I'm not sure what the anatomy is. That's an amazing piece of information because that tells me that when you get to that place in the future, you're not just going to plow ahead and cut the common duct in two. You're going to slow down. You're going to think about it. And that is incredibly powerful.
Please make your questions really quick because we would like to move a little bit into what's really coming.
Yeah, you probably are going to answer it in the next section, but for all of us raised in a system of you go from kindergarten to first grade, then you go to high school and you graduate on time. How are we going to transform a graduate level program to competency based? Like, what does that really look like? And I don't know if you guys want to comment now or just wait till the next part of the section.
I just shortly, because I think it's an important question. I doubt we're going to transform that overnight. We might transform that in 25 years. I think what we're going to do now that we've never really done before, when the ABS rolls us out, we're actually going to have an accurate assessment of where people are at the end of 5 years. Right now, they graduate, they pass their boards, and the board passage rates are pretty high. And most of them are pretty good surgeons, but we don't actually assess their ability to provide care across the continuum at the moment of graduation. And I think it's having an accurate assessment of where people are. You can't get better if you don't know where you're starting from. And I think it's that common understanding of where people are that will really help us improve the profession.
To add to what you're saying, the individual has to have some self-confidence, and that needs to be asked and be understood.
So obviously, I guess we are here, right? At the end of the day, we are here with EPAs. And could you tell us a little bit about what the next steps look like? When it does it start? What's the timeline? And definitely would like to talk a little bit about program preparation. You can take it in any order you guys.
You
want.
give me
You're
2
running
seconds.
Yeah, go ahead.
Hold on. So we're going to skip the difficult scenario. And we'll go right ahead as a prompt for everybody. There we go. There. What's coming next?
I think this is really hard. And I think this is the elephant in the room, right? So we're all overachievers, right? Surgeons are by definition overachievers. So when the American Board of Surgery says, hey, all the interns entering in the class of 2023 have to be assessed on the EPAs, then we all think, okay, so in the first year, we're going to get them all done, right? And everybody's going to be ready, right? And we're going to be ready to do it all. And that's not the goal. This is if you think about it, if you enter a surgical residency in 2023 as an intern, you're actually not going to be done until 2028. And so we don't actually have to know where you're at on all 18 of these EPAs until the moment of graduation. So if you're a program director right now, you got 5 years to figure this out. What we do want to see in the first year, what the board wants to see in the first year, and this is, I'm speaking for Dr. Bice, we'd like to see progressive engagement. I think a program would be super successful implementing the EPAs if they could get some EPA assessments on most of the EPAs on all of their interns by the end of the first year. If they got some EPA assessments on all of their interns in the first year, that would be a success.
And at the same time, for some programs that are really eager to dive in with this, so raising our hands here on behalf of UAB, then there's no reason you can't use EPAs for all of your trainees if you would like. And my own personal bias is that will make rolling it out easier for everyone. The faculty won't have to remember, okay, I'm working with an intern today. We're going to do EPAs. Oh, I've got this PGY3. No, I'm not doing EPAs. It's the same problem as only, having 2 EPAs at your program. You don't know when to do it. You don't know when to not do it. So it's an opportunity that people will have. Now, what the practicalities, how are we going to collect these assessments? Dr. Greenberg had said early on that programs did this in different ways. The most successful programs utilized a mobile app. You'll see on the slide that it contains the acronym for SIMPLE, and that's because the American Board of Surgery has entered into a partnership with the SIMPLE Collaborative to utilize a modified version of their platform. So it'll be called Simple EPA or something like that. Probably that title hasn't been entirely finalized, but it'll be different from the Simple OR that those of you that have used that platform in the past it'll be designed specifically to collect EPA assessments. That is being provided free of charge to any program that would like to use it on behalf of the ABS to try to ensure that there are not inequities between programs that may or may not be able to buy their way into a collaborative or purchase a resource. It doesn't mean that if you have a solution that you've been using and would like to continue, you don't have to utilize that. But when the individual trainees finish, the ones that start in July of 2023, when they finish at earliest in June of 2028, they will be required to submit data back to the ABS. I wanted to make one final comment that ties into something that Dr. Sorosi was talking about in terms of gathering data about where people are. The board is also trying to be, and none of this has been entirely decided upon, so we'll stick a little pin in it for now. But the goal is not to say that everyone must be entrusted at a practice-ready level for all 18 EPAs to be eligible to sit for certification. We fully recognize that if that were to be said, then magically everyone is going to be practice-ready at the time that they finish their general surgery training, right? Like, we all know how to get through the things that we have to get through and check the boxes that need to be checked and all of that. And so the goal is really to have an honest assessment of where people are and not be penalized in some way if they are not meeting some artificially imposed level.
The board is also very cognizant of the fact that this is a huge change for everyone. And so they not only have they entered into this contractual agreement with Simple, but between now and the July rollout, the board is putting forth a lot of materials to help and support systems. So if you follow, I think it's like ABS_EPA on Instagram, like you'll see constant reminders about webinars, panel discussions. They're building a repository of talks where we just got emails about joining a speaker board for grand rounds at different institutions to help spread knowledge and information about this. On most of the tables, you'll find a card with a QR code on them. If you scan it, you can sign up to become an EPA champion. And we would absolutely welcome your support in helping to spread and disseminate this to your programs at home. But definitely a lot of work on faculty and resident development to help ease with this transition.
Let me ask.
I
sorry,
want to make one tag on comment to what I thought you were going to say. And that is, when he started off the sentence, the ABS fully recognizes, I was like, oh yes, fully recognizes the discomfort that sits with people as a trainee. This would totally be me, I understand. I would not want the ABS to have any information about my ongoing performance during residency.
That
Period,
gets
full stop.
exactly to my question.
That's what
Okay.
I was going to ask.
Thank you.
Can I jump in and ask it real quick? So certainly,
we see residents that are maybe a little bit on the struggle bus. And I'm from Wake Forest. My name is Luke Neff. I'm a pediatric surgeon. And, we are right there with our residents for just about every step of that clinical care, just because of the nature of what we do. And certainly understand the need for greater autonomy in other domains. But, we see residents that don't really put it all together till the very end. And we also have many residents that pursue fellowships. And that, you create this metric now that's taken as gospel. And I'm thinking this is a great idea, by the way, just full disclosure. And I'm excited about it. I want to touch on the Simple app and how we can integrate that. But, you all of a sudden you have this, and how does that information get used and as a program? Because it's a two-way street, right? You want to put your potential fellowship applications and applicants forward in the best possible light. On the other side, there's a program director really trying to understand and sift through, these mountains of applicants and figure out who their person is going to be or how they're going to rank things. And so there's this disclosure piece that could be a little bit, especially given the fact that maybe that person is going to be an amazing fellow, he or she will, but just hasn't put all of it together in that culmination of a chief residency year where it just starts to click. And so I wonder about some of these, they kind of open Pandora's box by having this really sophisticated and really thoughtful way of doing it, but then it has all these second and third order effects that aren't considered. And then just, I'll sit down, but just curious about people's, how many folks are using the Simple app and how we can just increase adoption. Because I'm, banging on a drum trying to get our residents to submit their cases and get our faculty to give a damn, to be honest. Excuse my French. Thank you.
Vanessa, as you answer this question, just make sure you go back to who's going to have access to the outcomes and
Yeah.
information.
Absolutely. So that's what I was going to bring up. So thank you for your question. We were entirely aligned. And the board recognizes it's very, very important for them to not have access to the data. There is a firewall. All of these data will live within the Simple collaborative in their own data repository. The board has no access to any of that information. And the plan is actually for the individual candidate to get their information, and then the individual, when they apply for certification, will then upload it to the board. So the data won't have any transfer relationship between Simple, the repository it's held in, and the ABS itself.
I would just to structurally, so there are two kinds of assessments in an EPA, and it's important that we talk briefly about this. So when you watch someone provide care, you do what's called a micro assessment or a formative assessment. It's like, at this particular moment, this particular time, this is where I rate you. Every 6 months, your clinical competency should look at all of the EPA micro assessments you have for a single EPA, and they should give each resident a summative entrustment rating of where they are every 6 months. At the end of your training, what the board will ask is that you submit your final summative assessment on these 18 EPAs to the board. That's all they'll see. So they won't see that you were at direct supervision with cholecystectomy until well into your 4th year. They'll see that you were at practice ready level at the end of your 5th year, if you got there, or that you were at indirect supervision, right? It does make sense. And I just would say this, it would be hard as a program director to say that someone's ready to be a surgeon if they still require direct supervision in something that surgeons do every day, right? I think that's an important part of it. But right now, we don't really ask that, right? You're required to submit 6 operative assessments and 6 clinic assessments. Well, you're actually retired to do them. You're not even required to submit them. So you could have 6 operative assessments that say that you can't operate your way out of a paper bag, and you're still eligible for board certification today, right? And so I think that the summative ratings, so we won't see you along the way. We'll just see where you get to at the end. And I think in many ways, if you think about it, it's almost a prompt to a program director. If you have someone who's on the struggle bus, right, you got to focus on helping them get better, right? If someone is lagging way behind, that's an important piece of information, and it suggests you need to think differently about how you train them.
And the other thing that you can do with that data when you're on the CCC, and many of the programs in the pilot did this, you can blind that data, right? You can take that data as a graph and say, okay, I don't know which resident I'm assessing, but based on what I see in these numbers, that resident should be entrusted at this level. And then when you go back and do your milestones, unblind it and see if it still aligns with their overall assessment, but it gets rid of some of they could probably do that. They should be fine, right? Like I've watched them do one case and they're perfectly fine. Like Data is data, and now you can use it in a meaningful way as data should be used.
And in the same way that Dr. Sarosi kind of broke it down to say, you know, each individual microassessment is formative, and then there are these summative decisions, and the summative decision at the end is what's going to the ABS. On the other hand, individual programs will have access to all of the data from their trainees in a reporting function from Simple, so that individual programs can utilize that in real time and help people to understand, you know, how they can get to the next level from where they're at.
So you made it a little bit double-blinded. I see that. And I also see internal benchmarking. Any external benchmarking?
Pin, that
Can
sounds
you,
like
can
a
you
pin.
describe exactly what you
Yeah,
mean
I think,
then by
you know, like
external
if the
benchmarking?
program has access to the other trainees, they can have level set and say, at this point in July, we have this many people completing this number of EPAs. How does that person stand next to another program or
Yeah.
national?
I personally see all of
I don't
those.
know if you heard that, but that's the answer anyway.
Questions about how does, you know, in September, how many assessments have been collected by, you know, your residents at a specific level, and how do their levels of entrustment compare across programs? I personally see those as research questions. And as someone who's very interested in education scholarship, I can tell you that you can't get those data from the ABS, right? So there is a group of us that's putting together a consortium of institutions, and we are planning to pool our data together to start to answer some of those research questions well before 2028.
Thank you.
So if anyone would like to be part of said consortium, please get in touch. We would love to have you participate.
Excellent idea. Please.
Hi, I'm Elizabeth Menino. I'm currently in PGY3 at East Tennessee State University. I'm just wondering, how is this going to affect our staff's willingness to let PGY 4s and 5s participate in teaching assistant cases? Because a lot of, you know, our program is very big on, you know, starting PGY 4 year. We take junior residents and, you know, start doing the cases together with attending supervision, of course. But is there thought about how this will affect that relationship?
Yeah, I mean, I think that certainly the hope is that it will increase that opportunity, right? So again, we looked at this within our own data. In the 2 years of the pilot, we had at UW, we were, before the pilot was implemented, we were in the 77th percentile on our ACGME numbers of teach assist cases. Over the course of the next 2 years, we went up to the 91st and then the 94th percentile in the number of teach assist cases. I can't tell you honestly that it was only because of this, but I certainly think it had something to do with that jump, right? I think that we focus much more on autonomy and entrustment, and people start hearing those words over and over. And then more importantly, the residents could show people in their app what they were entrusted to do with their data and say, hey, instead of, you know, showing me your way of doing this lap chole, why don't you let me take someone through it? I'm scoring up here at level 5 consistently. So my hope is that it will give you some data to hopefully increase those numbers.
I look for the day. Resident shows me the app and goes, hey, I'm ready, damn it.
Yeah, one of the other implications of entrustment, though, and this gets to your question. So those who are entrusted by multiple faculty members are capable of assessing entrustment in others, right? It's sort of an achievement, right? So once you're entrusted, you're no different at some level. I mean, you're different than the faculty in a lot of ways, but you're entrusted in this activity. So you should be able to assess other people's ability. And so I think one of the implications, we did not do this in the pilot. All of the evaluations had to be completed by faculty. But I think one of the exciting things and how this could potentially transform teaching and residency is if at the end of your 3rd year, you're entrusted to perform a cholecystectomy at a practice-ready level. Why wouldn't we let you function as a teaching assistant, right? We said you're practice-ready. So why can't you, under supervision, help someone else? So I think in some ways, this could actually be a powerful lever. Every training program has some faculty who never let you do anything, right? And if you can show them that like 5 other faculty trust you at a practice-ready level, puts a lot of pressure on them, right? In a good way, right?
Yeah, great.
Yeah, Wendy Green, Emory University. Hi, Dr. Cornwell. Have you done any background evaluation as to see what causes malpractice claims? Where does the harm come to patients most often? What is that, either personality type? What kind of ethical mannerisms? What is it that causes the most harm to patients that ends up in litigation? And if we could figure out who that biggest harm level is, maybe we should be trying to also test that as part of the evaluation, because we don't want to let people out who are harmful and could endanger the reputation of our institution of being surgeons. Thank you.
So that was Dr. Johnson's second scenario that we didn't get to, but take that on. Is there a way of taking that information from whether it's patient safety or litigation and bringing it back to an EPA?
So the EPA research project hasn't really done information out. There is a lot of data collected on malpractice claims, and most of them arise from poor communication. Like the number one cause of litigation is poor communication and a perception from the patient that either you weren't telling them what was going on or you were withholding things. That frequently leads to malpractice. The board has done some research on malpractice claims, and there is an article, I think it's been published, or it's certainly working its way through, that actually shows that people who struggle to practice their certifying exams are at risk of increased litigation. And actually there is some pretty strong data that people who never become certified are more likely to have adverse license actions than people who are successfully certified.
Hello, I'm LaDonna. I'm a resident at Howard. Thank you all for your fantastic work. Thank you for bringing this conceptual framework to really assessing training preparedness. A couple of questions. EPAs are coming. They're coming in July. And I wanted to know from your pilots that were done, if you all had any information that we could take back to our own programs about what was successful. How did you engage the key stakeholders in this conversation? How did you implement this successfully? And what should we be doing from now until July to get ourselves prepared? Thank you.
So that was an excellent question from a plant perspective. I also want to thank, recovering program director, Dr. Philip Ramsey, for that question a few days ago. How do we engage everybody in this process? Because clearly there are going to be early adopters. Many of them are on this stage. And there are going to be people who are not even in this room who need to know that this is coming. So how do we do this beyond monetary and other competition-based incentive processes?
Well, I think those work great. No, so we spent an enormous amount of time at the beginning of the pilot focused on faculty and resident development. So for the first couple weeks of the year, we stole sort of educational time, so grand rounds and M&M time, and we had the faculty and the resident do training programs together, where they sort of broke up. They learned the levels of entrustment for each of the different ones and taught it to one another. And so one, it was a great way for the incoming interns to meet their co-residents and to meet with the faculty in a very low stakes way. Two, it put everyone into sort of a shared mental model of what different residents at different levels of entrustment should look like at each of these different EPAs. And it showed that we were really focused on this. Every month I would send out an email to the faculty and the residents that was just flat out names of who performed well and who didn't perform. And I would try every time to be at the top of that list. And when I wasn't, I would acknowledge the people that were above me. And I would always acknowledge the faculty that responded to 100% of their micro assessments, even if it was just like 3 or 4 of them. So I think that focusing on it was key to engagement and making it last. But then I think the engagement continued to grow over the course of the first years. I think the thing that I think we would all feel is true is that this is not going to be an overnight change, right? It's not like you're going to hit the ground running and just succeed and thrive. I think the more that you do it and the more that you keep your foot on the gas, the more people see actual benefits from it. And it's going to take time for it to change and to move forward. But it's not only happening in general surgery, right? So that one, medical students get EPAs right now, general surgery residents. In the next coming years, it's integrated vascular, pediatrics, critical care, and endocrine fellowships have this. The MIS, GI, and bariatric fellowships through the Fellowship Council all have EPA. So this is going to become part of our language for all of us as we go from med school to practicing professional. And so I think it will come with time, but the things that you can do now are pay attention to the materials that the board is putting out, try and convince your institutions that we should have a grand rounds on this in the next couple months to year and really just embrace it.
And if I could add one thing to that, I wish I could have said, don't go past that slide, because at the bottom of the slide that was on the screen where we collected the responses about how we can get faculty buy-in. Right, so the one that we can see at the bottom, decreasing the workload of other evaluations in exchange for completion of EPAs. John Mellinger, who is vice president of the American Board of Surgery and is in charge of the EPA project more broadly, likes to use the phrase addition by subtraction. I think that's really important. The board certainly is very cognizant of the need to not add to everyone's workload with this. They're pretty easy to do, each individual EPA micro assessment, but if you think about it, they are duplicative of some of the other pieces of information that we collect. And in my mind, specifically what I'm talking about are end of rotation evaluations. Maybe there are some of you in the audience that really find a lot of value out of the end of rotation evaluations. I would love to talk to you if so. Because I personally don't. And I think that's sort of like this inside joke around amongst most people, right? Like it's someone at the beginning was like, oh yeah, good resident, read more. That's often what's on there, or it's just sort of like a checklist of milestones or a checklist of competencies. It's not actually all that helpful. And so we'll have information about milestones. It's baked in to the EPAs because they have been, each EPA is mapped to about 5 to 7 different milestones and subcompetencies. And so the CCC can map that back and use that to populate their milestones. Now, EPAs are not the only type of assessment that we can use. We'll have to supplement with some other things, but I think we can vastly shorten our end of rotation evaluations. And I think it's going to look a little bit different for each program. And so would encourage each of you to think about the ways that you can engage in this addition by subtraction in your local setting.
So we were worried that we wouldn't be able to fill information for 90 minutes, and clearly we have run over. So I would really appreciate, I would like a round of applause for the subject matter experts here on talking about EPOs. That was fantastic. There's a webinar, I think on February 22nd, if I'm not mistaken, from the American Board of Surgery. And then please find them in the hallway to ask further questions. Really appreciate everyone joining, and we move on to the next part of the program. Thank you.
Thank
It was really opaque and it's like in a fog.